Here are 5 players to get in your fantasy lineups this weekend. All right, let's start with Kimani Vidal. LA Chargers, they are home for the Indianapolis Colts this week. Hand up, I was completely wrong about the Chargers backfield last week. I fell for the Hassan Haskins will be the starter ruse, just hook, line, and sinker. Could not have gone worse. To be fair, both guys played early on. The Chargers, in my opinion, did the smart thing. They rode the hot hand. That was obviously Kimani Vidal, who looked significantly better than Hassan Haskins, a lot faster, a lot more decisive. By the end of that game, we saw Vidal outsnap Haskins 43-20, out-carried him 18-6, ended up getting most of the early down work. Haskins did get a red zone carry, did absolutely nothing with it. So knowing what we know now, I think we have to assume Vidal will get the first crack this week. It's not nearly as good of a matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, so temper your expectations. You don't get to play the Dolphins every week, but Vidal's still in starting territory for me. You got Bucky Irving injured, Derrick Henry, James Cook on bye. Totally justifiable to throw him out there. Still might even be available on waivers in some shallower leagues. I'm not sure I want to deal with the Arizona backfield, the Houston backfield, New England, New Orleans, KC, Tennessee, some other backfields that have some question marks. So we'll walk back everything we said a week ago when I told you to start Hassan Haskins. We're going to roll with Kimani Vidal this week in a huge home matchup for the LA Chargers. Next on the list, we have a tight end, Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Otton is somebody I've been looking at on waivers for a couple of weeks, was able to snag him in a few leagues heading into week 7. It's only about 15% rostered in ESPN leagues, not really being started in too many spots, but I think he is a reasonable start this week, certainly as a tight end, maybe even as a flex spot if you're up against it at wide receiver or running back. Had some big wide receiver injuries last week, and frankly, I'm not sure I want to roll the dice on the secondary options for Arizona, Tennessee, the Rams, certainly not the Jets, and even in Tampa Bay, we saw all 3 of Tez Johnson, Cameron Johnson, Sterling Shepard make plays last week for the Buccaneers, but picking between those 3 this week with Mike Evans maybe coming back, it just feels like a total crapshoot. And to me, there's a case to be made that Otton might be the safest pivot in that Tampa Bay offense. If you're looking at those passing game options, he's coming off of 2 really solid games, 4 for 81 against Seattle, 5 for 51 against the 49ers, 11 total targets across those 2 games. And keep in mind, last year when the injuries set in for Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, there was an 8-game run where we saw Cade Otton average about 6 catches, 56 yards on over 8 targets per game. So I think we could see that same thing play out again this year. Should be a pretty pass-friendly matchup against Detroit this week. No Bucky Irving for Tampa Bay. Detroit down a ton of key defensive backs. Brian Branch suspended for this game. I'm totally fine starting Cade Otton this week. Not really going to feel great about it, but if you're in a pinch, you could throw him out there. And I don't mind holding on to him for week 8 when we have 6 teams, a ton of key pass catchers on bye. Next up on the list, we go to a running back, Quinshon Judkins of the Cleveland Browns. And look, I know this one should be obvious, but hey, he was on the bench in about 30% of ESPN leagues last week. I'm begging you, please do not leave him on your bench this week. Get Quinshon Judkins in your lineup going up against the Miami Dolphins. I know it's the Browns. They don't score points. They haven't scored more than 17 in 11 straight games, which is just a preposterous streak. But the Browns are at home. They get the Dolphins this week. We don't need to go over the numbers once again on Miami. Just let me assure you, if you don't want to look it up, this is the worst run defense in the NFL. Kimani Vidal became the latest back to run all over that defense last week. I have no idea why the Browns threw the ball 52 times against Pittsburgh in week 6. I don't know why Quinshon Judkins only carried the ball 12 times. I think we see a big-time reversal this week. The Browns defense should be able to hold down the Dolphins. Cleveland, they know they can win this game on the ground. There's no reason for Dylan Gabriel to be throwing it around 35-plus times. I think we're looking at a 20-plus carry day for Quinshon Judkins. Should be a monster fantasy spot. Maybe the best spot of the season to use Quinshon Judkins. Another running back I'm looking to start this week, Jordan Mason of the Minnesota Vikings. I have a ton of Jordan Mason this season, seeing more opportunity with Aaron Jones on IR. Of course, Vikings coming off of a bye week after the Dublin game. I'm in a few leagues where he's a borderline starter for me, but I'm leaning towards starting him over guys like Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker, J.K. Dobbins. Those are all tough calls. Could go either way, but I lean Jordan Mason there. I know he's coming off of 2 rough games against Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Did at least score a touchdown in the Cleveland game, but didn't get to 60 yards in either of those. Still have to be encouraged by the overall volume. 16 carries, 13 carries in those 2 games. Caught 3 passes in each of them. I think the floor will again be there this week, especially if the Vikings do go back to J.J. McCarthy. As I record this, it's up in the air. Could be McCarthy, could be Wentz. Maybe the time off ends up being good for McCarthy. I'm still not sure the Vikings really want him whipping the ball around. It's probably a run-based approach. You look at this matchup against the Eagles, Vikings are at home. On paper, it doesn't seem like a good spot. We're kind of conditioned to just avoid the Philadelphia Eagles, but I don't know if Jalen Carter is going to be out there. Nolan Smith is on IR, a couple other injuries on that defense. We just saw Cam Scadaboo run for almost 100 yards, 3 touchdowns last week. On the season, the Eagles ranked 25th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They've given up 6 rushing touchdowns to the position, almost 4.5 yards per carry. It's simply not the same defense that was number 1 in the NFL last season in fantasy points allowed to running backs at just 16 per game. So I'm comfortable starting Mason this week, leaning into this matchup, counting on what should be another high volume spot for him. And keep in mind, Aaron Jones, for what it's worth, eligible to return from IR in week 8. So we'll see what that split ends up being once Aaron Jones is back. But there's a chance this is the last week where Jordan Mason is the unquestioned number 1 back in Minnesota. To finish out our list of fantasy starters this week, we go with the quarterback, Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. And look, you got Josh Allen on bye this week. The Ravens are on bye. So maybe you're still just trying to figure things out week to week with Lamar Jackson. How about Caleb Williams? Very quietly QB7 on the season in terms of fantasy points per game, coming off a nice 20 fantasy point performance in that Monday night win over the Commanders. Had a 29 fantasy point game in week 3, 24 fantasy points back in week 1. Every single game, there are still a couple of those, okay, what the hell was that type of plays from Caleb Williams? But I think we're seeing progress. I think we're starting to see him mesh a little bit more with Ben Johnson. He was getting the ball out a lot more quickly in that Washington game. Still hunting some big plays down the field, still using his legs when he has to. On balance, he's more of a matchup-based starter for me. I'm not just locking him in every week, but I think this is a good one against New Orleans at home. Saints are 28th in the NFL in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season, 24.5 fantasy points per game given up to the position. We just saw Drake May carve up that secondary last week. The Saints have already allowed 14 passing touchdowns. That's the second most in the NFL, 25th in yards per target allowed. They've also given up the 4th most rushing yards to quarterbacks. With the Bears picking up some momentum, I think this is a spot where you could think about sliding Caleb Williams in, start in just 40% of ESPN leagues in week 6. I think we're looking at 20, 25 plus fantasy point upside in this spot.